As we continue our journey here of trying to fill out this table, we are going to look at the signs of the trigonometric ratios in the four quadrants. In order to do this, we're going to look at angles in each quadrant. So these are going to be in standard position, just any angle there in the first quadrant. Then I'm going to look at some angle here in the second quadrant, an angle here in the third quadrant, and then an angle over in the fourth quadrant, and we're going to come up with some information here, some important stuff. So if we have an angle here, if we wanted the sine of this angle, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a triangle, and in order to get to this point here, so our radius is always a positive. We're going to kind of think about the unit circle here. So our radius is going to be positive. I'll go ahead and zoom in for now because we don't need the whole thing. So this will be positive, this will be positive, and this will be positive. But in order to get to this point on a coordinate plane, we have to go to the right, which is positive, and up, which is positive. And so what we want to do is we want to consider if this is angle theta, and we're not going to find the actual value, we just want to look at the sines. Well, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So if we look opposite, it's going to be positive over our hypotenuse, which is positive. So sine is positive. Now looking at cosine. Cosine of that angle, that's adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent is positive over opposite, which is positive, which is positive. And then tangent of theta, that's opposite over adjacent. So opposite over adjacent, positive over positive, which is positive. So all of them are positive in the first quadrant. So you might have thought, well, that was kind of boring. Well, it will change things a little bit here as we get into the second quadrant. So in the second quadrant, in order to make a triangle, we would have to go left, which is actually negative, and up. So negative and positive. And we can think of this as theta again. And so we have sine of theta is opposite, which is positive, over hypotenuse, which is positive. So that's positive. Cosine, however, is adjacent, which is negative over positive. So a negative divided by a positive is negative. And tangent is opposite, which is positive, over adjacent, which is negative. So once again, we get a negative. So in the second quadrant, sine is positive. So all are positive in the first quadrant. Sine is positive in the second quadrant. Let's go ahead and look at the third quadrant. We'll do our work maybe up here. Sine of the angle, cosine of the angle, and tangent of the angle. And to get to this point, we have to go left, which is negative, and down, which is negative. And I'll put the positive over here with our hypotenuse. And so sine is opposite, which is negative, over hypotenuse, which is positive. Negative over a positive is negative. Cosine is adjacent, which is negative, over hypotenuse. So that's negative. And then tangent, however, is negative over a negative. Negative divided by negative is positive. So in the third quadrant, tangent is positive. And the fourth quadrant, you're probably guessing what it's going to be, but we'll take a look anyway. Again, we'll look at sine, cosine of the angle, and tangent. And to get to somewhere in the fourth quadrant, we have to go positive and then negative. So theta is going to be opposite, which is negative, over positive. So that's a negative. Cosine is adjacent, so positive over positive, which is positive. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent, negative over positive, which is negative. And so in the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive. And so I'm going to take this information and put it just on this little graph right here. All, so we're just talking about the positives, all are positive, sine is positive, tangent's positive in the third, and cosine is positive in the fourth. And that's talking about the sines of the different trig ratios. There's a little way to remember this. Some people remember A for all, S students take calculus. So that's just a way to remember as you work through there. All students take calculus. All are positive. Sine's positive. Tangent's positive. And cosine is positive. And that, we actually won't fill out a whole lot of our chart now. But we can kind of start because when we say one of the things is positive, that means the other two are negative. So in the first quadrant, everything's positive. But once we get to the second quadrant, which I marked before, we know that just sine is positive, which means the others are negative. So we know that cosine, those are going to be negative, and tangent, those three are going to be negative. Once we get to the third quadrant, tangent's positive, which means sine and cosine are negative. So we know those three. Put that in the wrong spot. These three in the third quadrant will be negative for sine and for cosine. And then looking at the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive, which means sine and tangent are negative. So we know these will be negative. Sine and tangent will be negative. So we're getting closer. And actually now, we can fill out the rest of this table once we talk about a couple special triangles and the special angles within those triangles.